the government to do something and left to die. Right. So like, if you think about empower for that perspective, right? A community like New Orleans where Black people are deeply present, right? You don't get any culture in the Gulf Coast without Black culture, right? And so Black people are deeply present, but are on their roofs begging for the government to do something. And the thing about Katrina and the thing about all these moments that I think illustrate what I believe about power is that it showed all these things that people already knew. Right? Geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what's happened to our planet, all the ways in which the structural racism undergirds those things. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, corporations, and media. When institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report you have. It doesn't matter what kind of coding you have. It doesn't matter what kind of work you do in the courts if you don't have the power to implement it. You can't research your way or code your way or legal your way or nonprofit executive direct your way out of a problem like that. And it's not that information is power, it's that power is power, and that you need people and you need the ability to force institutions to do things. And so I've always believed that you do that through building infrastructure, and you do that by building the forces that that allow for people to coalesce and come together and align in ways that build something that can be a force multiplier for change.
That's wild. That's it's amazing that we're in this moment again, 16 years after Katrina, and we're looking at obviously a similar situation, which is symbolic of a bunch of patterns. It's the patterns of racism and housing patterns, but it's also the patterns of climate change and just all of that. And it's interesting because we actually, Latasha and I, had some of our origins of our current work were also in Katrina, because we did a lot of disaster relief, assistance, recovery work. I mean, so and a lot of the ways that we did that work then is a part of the way that we do our work today with Black Voters Matter. And so it's interesting that we've got this commonality, and not just us. I think there's a lot of people who had either an awakening or the birth of some type of organizational infrastructure, like you were just talking about, out of that experience. That's part of the paradox, that in a disaster like that, both natural disaster and human man-made disaster, person-made disaster, that sometimes that is exactly what births a color of change or an organizing philosophy that then leads to Black Voters Matters, that out of that moment of powerlessness comes these vehicles focused on building power. So that's really striking.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I do think disasters and challenge can sometimes be the birth of new forms of power, new forms of new technologies for our liberation. And I fundamentally believe that Black people have constantly had to sort of take the worst moments and leverage them in order to build something new, in order to build something more powerful. And out of that, be able to not just sort of mitigate harm, but hopefully unlock joy.
Right. That's right. And that's the critical part of this work. So let's talk about that a little bit more, or let's talk about the transitions or the trajectory. Here's color of change created out of this tragedy. But y'all don't just go away, right? Like you said, you build an institution that has now, like you said, been around for 16 years. Like talk about that, like the role that color of change has played in shaping the way that we think about our power. You know, the way that we view being connected and taking collective action and all that. Like, what is color of change's role in building power?
Yeah, I mean, we see ourselves as a vehicle for strategic action, to not speak for other people, but to provide the pathways for people to speak for themselves. And by strategic action, I mean finding the levers that by opening them can unlock the potential for real change, whether it's by holding corporations accountable, holding government accountable, changing the sort of role of the stories that are told about our community. Far too often, the stories that are told are stories that are unfortunate. Inequality is unfortunate, almost like a car accident. And we work really hard to tell the stories that are stories of injustice, right? When we tell stories that are unfortunate rather than unjust, we get charitable solutions to structural problems, right? And so much about what we're focusing on is not charity, but structural change. And what do I mean by that? I mean, not just sending water bottles to Flint, but actually cleaning up the pipes. I mean, not just fees at inner city schools, but actually dealing with the inequalities in public education, not just reentry programs, but actually the work to end mass incarceration. And so, it is not just in the sort of power of the campaigns that we run, whether it's, getting someone fired from, TV to send a clear message about a standard, about what's acceptable, about forcing credit card companies to stop processing fees for white nationalist organizations, forcing corporations to divest from the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, holding district attorneys accountable, and working to shift the policies and practices in their offices. All of these are some of the things that we do through strategic action, but it's also about how we tell the story, right? We will hear folks say, Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank. And I'm like, no, it's banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We'll hear people say that Black women are less likely to get hired by corporate America. And I'll say, no, corporate America excludes Black women. And why is that important, right? Even in terms of the language, it may feel like I'm talking in semantics here, but it's not. When we end up with Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, folks say, oh, wow, what's wrong with Black people? Let's actually give them some financial literacy so that they can do better inside of institutions which have targeted, excluded us, redlined us since their very beginning. When you say Black women are less likely to get hired by corporate America, you're like, what's wrong with Black women? Maybe they need mentorship so that they can do better inside of racist, misogynist structures which have excluded them time and time again. And so it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing structures. And so constantly our work is not about what does it mean to fix Black people, who are the most resilient and powerful people the world has known. It's about how do we remove the barriers and obstacles? How do we dismantle the structures and the systems which have far too often held us back and which are not unfortunate, but are unjust and have actually created inequality, because inequality is not an accident. Inequality is manufactured. And the only way that you end that is by going directly at those that manufacture it, both the people, the principles, and the practices. And we have to dismantle all three. If you just dismantle the people, the principles and the practices will always regenerate more people. If you just in the practices, the principles and the people will get more new practices and new practices over time. And we see that, right? Some of the ways in which we were discriminated before have just gotten better because of technology and have become more easy because of technology. And so that is part of how we think about the work. And we try to think about it through a 21st century lens. And what I mean by that, it's recognizing that we're on the ground in communities through our Black women's brunches, through our offline program, but also we recognize that people live in geographic worlds and they live in virtual worlds. And how do we find ways to meet people where they're at in both of those ways and then provide the best ways for people to take action? So you will never see a campaign from Color of Change that says, tell Mitch McConnell to stand up for affirmative action. Because we know that no matter how many people sign that petition, that dude is never going to stand up for affirmative action. Or what you might see is us going at corporations who run Black History Month programs saying they care about affirmative action and then give money to Mitch McConnell, and we might run a campaign against them. And so constantly sort of looking at what is the right lever, what is the right strategy, and what is the sort of best way that we can leverage the current power we have to advance and build more power over time, more change over time.
That's fascinating. That's incredible. And y'all have obviously been successful at doing exactly that, right? You don't get to stick around for 16 years in this field by not doing a bunch of stuff, right? So look, I wonder sometimes if you ever become a victim of your own success. And I mean that in a couple of ways. In a lot of ways, the name Color of Change is almost synonymous with the things that you were just describing, right? Like mass mobilizing our folks, communicating with our folks, holding companies accountable. Does there ever come a time where you feel the pressure to, when certain types of situations happen, that you feel this pressure of, we got to do this, right? That we got to take this on. I'm not saying that from a savior perspective, right? But just in terms of the reality that because you've been so good at having an impact, that the pressure then gets ramped up on, you got to
Yeah.
always have that impact. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Oh, I understand exactly what you're asking. It's one of the things that it's one of the things that keep me up at night, brother. I think you probably feel it too. And so we both understand that. Look, it's an awesome responsibility to lead this infrastructure. But it's a responsibility. It's a calling. And I don't own it. It's not mine. Right. And for as long as I'm leading it, I need to do everything I can to make sure that it is focused and of service in the moments that require. Now, the staff at Color of Change, and myself included, we're not robots. We're human beings. We are breathing. We are living, and we are impacted by some of the harmful things that are happening to our communities. We are impacted personally as much as we have to be, strategists for the response. And so all those things are things that we have to balance, and things that are absolutely part. It also makes us more human, and I think more effective, right? And when you know the people, and you know the situation, you know the harm, the sort of the standard for what is a solution, the standard for what is good execution, right, is much closer to you. But I feel a lot of responsibility. And when we hit the mark or whether we don't hit the mark, I'm constantly trying to figure out, how can we do this better? How can we do this more efficiently? How can we scale up our work so maybe we don't have to fight as much? I remember when I got to Color of Change almost over 10 years ago, we were 5.5 staff members. And we shared a small office out in the East Bay. It was hard to get folks to return my calls, right? I'd pick up the phone and say, Mr. Rashad Robinson, Color of Change, and we want to talk about this article or this thing that we're upset about, and nobody would call. And I came from GLAAD, a very powerful media advocacy LGBT organization, and was used to people returning my calls. Those first couple of months of folks not returning the calls could have made a lot of people feel like that is a problem. But I just kind of kept a list and made sure that folks returned the call. I kept a list. I remember being in a green room at Fox and Pat Buchanan asking me to go get him a glass of water because he thought I was a PA, and only to come back a couple of years later and getting him fired from MSNBC. And so I didn't have to say anything in that moment. What I had to do was recognize where we were at from a powerful perspective. I didn't have to be loud in that moment or push back. I had to think about, what do I have to build so these folks return our phone calls, so these folks respond. Going back to that moment of no one being nervous about disappointing Black people, right, in the aftermath of Katrina, right, when Black folks on their roofs begging for the government to do something and no one is nervous. Part of the raising the floor on what's acceptable and pushing the ceiling up on what's possible is having institutions and decision makers have to have a different set of considerations when they think about our community. And part of what we're trying to do through power and building power is recognizing that there is a different floor, a different sort of baseline, and there's a whole new different ceiling of possibility if we do our work incredibly well.
You mentioned just now when you were talking about your previous experience with GLAAD. You talked about your experience growing up in Long Island, and you weren't out, and at some point you come out. And when we think about power, Black power in particular, I think there's a lot of connotations around it. Some negative, right? Like I always say, people treat it like it's a cuss word. Like people in a lot of communities we go to, they don't want to talk about power because there are perceptions of what power looks like. A lot of that is driven by some of the ways that power has been used against us so negatively. So we view power as being, like Dr. King said, power without love is reckless and abusive, right? We view power as being this negative. And there's some other connotations around it. And some of those connotations deal even with gender, right? power, particularly in terms of male power, toxic masculinity. And so when we talk about